Slight delay because I've just remembered to press the record button. There we go, back a bit. Okay, so now if you lose me, just unmute your microphone and shout at me, because it's a really weird experience sitting here all on my own and I can't talk to you, but I can reach you here. So I want to welcome you to this little talk this evening. I'm going to try to keep it under an hour, so we've got a bit of time, but the problem is there's just so much to tell you. So I've had to narrow it down. And in fact, I'm just going to concentrate today on talking about Wincobank Hall, Mary Ann Rawson and her family, and a little bit about the chapel, which is the legacy that she's left us. We've got another talk coming up, which is about Wincobank Hill. And I also do a separate talk about Zion Graveyard. And I think there's a talk in the making about the flower estate and the area as general. And I think that's something lots of people might be able to contribute to. So hopefully that's something for the future. But today, here we are. I'm here on behalf of all these groups, Friends of Wincobank Hill, Love Wincobank, Friends of Zion Graveyard, but particularly today up at Wincobank Undenominational Chapel, because we are celebrating 180 years of working with the local community. And that is a great, wonderful achievement. So this is the chapel. This is the outside of the chapel. I'm sitting inside, just next to that blue door. If you've never been here before, just to locate you, you need to think about the M1. So you're driving north on the M1, or you could be going south, and you get to junction 34, north and south. And in between that, we have the viaduct that passes over Meadowhall below. And if you're coming north on your left, to the north of Meadowhall and the Don Valley, you'll see Wincobank Hill with houses climbing right up it, but a lovely green woodland area at the end. And if you were in Meadowhall and you're standing looking north, you'll see the houses that climb up Jenkin Road, and we might even see a map in a minute. So here we are, here's the map. We've got this nice wiggly road coming up here. This is Jenkin Road that the Tour de France raced up. Here's the junction, this is Newman Road. And for about 15 years, I've lived on this road. And I was very curious when I moved here because we had a demolition site overgrown opposite me here, just where these roads were. And I didn't know what it was there for, but there were just the odd door step and gateway. I couldn't work out what had been there. So that's really what made me curious about trying to find out a little bit about the local history. And just taking this road a bit further, forking left, we come down here to where Wincobank Chapel is. Now, I'm going to talk about, I might, if it lets me move, Wincobank Hall. So this is the most beautiful painting. This is about the only thing that we have by Mary Ann Rawson's daughter, Lizzie, who is an accomplished artist. And in fact, some of her artwork is in archives in America because she sold her artwork to make funds, to raise funds for her project. which it was a girls' school in Turin. So this was an interesting family that grew up in Attercliffe, Kelham Island, moved to Attercliffe, came to Wincobank, but had contacts all over the world, and they have left their traces in archives, universities all over the world. But this is a particularly interesting picture because we often see a pen and ink reproduction of this, but this is taken from the original, and this was given to us, a copy of the original was given to us quite recently. And that family have that original painting. And here you can see Wincobank Hall and the whole length of it. And if you look across the front, you can see this wall, which I think ran along the line of Shire Green Lane, right round here. And currently the road forks and it comes up beside the house because they ran a new road through. I think this tree line is where Bluebell Road currently runs onto the hill. And if you look at the top of the hill, you can see the white cottages that were there until 1962. And of course, if you go right up the top, here you've got the extraordinary Wincobank Hill Fort. Now it looks a bit different. This is the Maplecroft estate here, and Newman Road runs down this side. But this is where Wincobank Hall stood, and in 1882, it was looking a little bit different from today. So it's a bit of a pale map. This is a hand-drawn map on canvas that's in the archive. This is just a section of it. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. And it was started in 1882 and it's been updated by hand. It covers Firth Park, Lower Wincobank, and that kind of area around it. But you can see again Newman Road coming down here, Jenkin Road, or the line of Jenkin Road coming down the hill here. And this is Wincobank Hall, the length of Wincobank Hall here, with farm buildings and outbuildings. And here's the road coming right round. That's the line now that Shire Green Road takes. And this is the line of Wincobank Avenue, comes down here. And here is the little chapel where I am today and the little schoolhouse. So 1795 was the time when the Reed family were actually living in Kelham Island, and they had just acquired works at the silver refinery just here at Royds Mill, and it's still here today. This is the River Don. It was rerouted at some point, so it's not quite the same shape as it is now. If you follow the river along, straight through to Brightside, we come back and we come back to Grimesthorpe here, and once again we can just see Jenkin Road winding up the hill right to the edge of Wincobank. And the reason that this map is because we're thinking about the Reed family who moved from Kelham Island down to Royds Mill. And they were just a little hop away from Wincobank, but Wincobank was very much to the country to them. So when they arrived in Wincobank, it was a rural idyll, a beautiful place to be. Now, Mary Ann Rawson, who I want to talk about, she really valued her family history. We know she cared about her family history because she wrote it and left it in the archives. And this is her exercise book with her own family tree. And she collected together letters from her great-grandfather and transcribed them. And they've been used in various publications, largely by the family members ever since. But there's a wealth of information to be found. And one of the things she talks about is her ancestors. And she's got a real sort of interest in them. And she talks about Dr. Joseph Turner, who was her grandmother's brother. And he was a contemporary of the French Revolution. And she talks about him. She's written the description of his life. And he was qualified as a medical doctor in Sheffield, and he was doing very well. But she says, like many young men of that time, he got interested in politics, and he was very taken with the idea of the French Revolution, being an ardent lover of liberty, she says. And so he set off to go to Paris to see what it was all about, thinking he could join this great movement for freedom and equality and liberty and the rights of the poor. But when he got there, he found, in his opinion, that it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And in fact, the people who were in control were not much better than the people he'd left behind. So he came back to Britain, but then realized that maybe he'd blotted his copybook. So he was in danger of being arrested. So he packed up, she says, his valuable library, and he set sail for the United States of America, which was, his contemporaries thought, the wise thing to do. Otherwise, he might have found himself arrested. She says it was a disastrous voyage, a most disastrous voyage, and he lost many of his books, apart from some that came back and, slightly damp, were still in the Wincobank library, in Wincobank Hall. Dr. Turner came back, and he had spent some time in the West Indies, where he'd got sunstroke, which she said he'd never quite recovered from. And so he lived in a little house in between Darnall come Attercliffe, which is still known as Doctor's Lane. And it's known as Doctor's Lane because he was such a character. He was very severe, very tall, quite bad-tempered, but he lived on his own in a house, grew his own produce, and never touched animal meat. So he was vegetarian and quite independent. So she was very taken, obviously, by this spirit of adventure and this uniqueness. She said it was quite scary, and it, as well as wearing this blue coat. And this picture isn't of him, but matches the description. He had this long blue coat and this staff. And when it was dirty underfoot, because of course there was all the horse droppings of the day, he would wear pattens, which this little elephant-looking like thing is actually sandals that they would wear to keep themselves out of all the muck. So she was quite interested in all these people, and she wrote about her grandfather, that he seems to have childhood to have had more spirit and ambition than any of his relatives. He came from a little village in Kilsby in Northamptonshire, and his family were farmers and weavers, and that should have been his profession. But at the time, the economic situation was grim because the factories were setting up, they were taking the work that the hand weavers would have done, and the corn laws were affecting the price of corn and the price of flour. So it was a very grim outlook for the people in the country. If you didn't go to the cities and settle down and crack on, you were in for a bad time. So John Reed, Mary Ann's grandfather, he set off and he went off to do an apprenticeship. He did an apprenticeship in chemistry and then came to Sheffield to put into practice what he'd learnt. And he had learnt from Samuel Ski, who had found out from Dr. John Roebuck how to separate silver and gold from the sweepings on the floor of the little mesters. Now, this was at the time of the repression of the nonconformists. So he had come from a family in Kilsby who had supported the parliamentarians in the Civil War. And at that time, after the Act of Unification, the government wanted everybody to adhere to the 39 Articles of the Church of England as set down in the Common Prayer Book. But the dissenters were those who refused to be governed by the Church of England and resisted the established religion. So they were Lutheran in belief, in that they were rejecting a lot of the ideas of the Catholic Church, but they were also resisting the control of the government, and they were in a head-on collision, really. They were not allowed, not supposed to be worshipping in their own homes. They could register part of their home as a meeting house, and Thomas Reed, who was John Reed's father, he is documented as registering part of the house as the meeting room. So this is a kind of meeting they would have had there. The chapel itself is still there. It's been built on the site of the original house. So effectively, Mary Ann's great-grandfather established that chapel in Kilsby, and I did go there, and it was quite a strange feeling to see it. Her grandfather, John Reed, was a major contributor to Queen's Street Congregational Chapel. There's a bit of a similarity, I think, there. The company that John Reed set up in Kelham Island is still trading today as Tesco, and it's got a remarkable history. He was a very inventive man, a very shrewd businessman. He put a lot of energy into his work. He set up from scratch. So first of all, he just went and collected the scrap off the floor. So a very early form of recycling. And then gradually, as his business was established, he was able to trade on this, and people would pay him to take the scrap away, and then they would get the balance back in what he was able to sell to them. So he started off on his own, and then he went into business with his cousin, and then with his son, and then eventually his son-in-law, William Wilson, took over. So easy to miss, at Washford Bridge, you just see this corrugated archway, is Tesco, which stands for the Sheffield Smelting Company, and their logo shows the extent of the works. So an extraordinary place. But when the Reeds moved from Kelham Island to Royds Mill in 1805, this is what it looks like. It had been a farm. I think it had been owned by Rhodes at some point, a Mr. Rhodes. It was known as Royds Mills, actually, and there were water mills and different kind of flour mills there. But they lived in this house. They moved there, and Mary Ann described it as just a rural idyll with a little bit of blue smoke rising from their chimney. So little did she know that that blue smoke was going to become the Attercliffe smog that filled the Don Valley, and that many people still remember. Now, her parents were very interesting people. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them shortly. But here we go. This is what Mary Ann had written in her family history. As she remembered, it seemed quite in the country. The view up to Attercliffe Bridge and beyond was very pretty, and at the back it was completely country. It's quite difficult to think of Attercliffe in those terms at the moment. But moving to Royds Mill, Joseph Reed did as his father had done and put money into establishing a chapel. And they established this one, along with Robert Deakin. He put money into building this very plain, austere, what would be a congregational chapel. And that's on the site of the church that became known as Zion Church, which was burnt down in the 1980s. So that's where the graveyard is, where she's buried. But this is the chapel that was there. Looking from Attercliffe across the Don Valley, it very quickly became industrialised. So although we can see at the front traces of that country she talked about, looking across, what you can see is the beckoning rural paradise of Wincobank Hill. And it was so nice that Joseph Reed took his family on holiday for 6 months in the summer to Wincobank, and they rented a farmhouse, and they loved it so much that they moved across the valley away from Attercliffe after 15 years of living there, away from Attercliffe, up to Wincobank. And so looking from the other way, because you can see Wincobank Hill just over here, that lovely, the tip of Wincobank Hill, and this is looking at it from the other direction. Oops, not very other direction. This is the pen and ink drawing that's taken from that painting that I showed you earlier on. And you can see that it's a copy really, but it shows the profile of the hill really nicely. So you can see why, after living in Attercliffe, they thought this was the place to be. But they also thought, well, this manor house that's here could be very useful for what we want to do, because they were still promoting the cause of the nonconformists, who were very interested in social reform, very interested in progress and change. They wanted to hear new ideas, and they wanted somewhere where they could invite people to come and talk and share ideas. So Wincobank Hill, what do we know about Wincobank Hall on Wincobank Hill? Now, Wincobank Hall, we know from an archaeological exploration is not quite the word, excavation in around about 2005, that it dates back at least to 1715, but it is possible that that was on the site of a manor house already in the possession of the Staniforth family, because Martha Staniforth brought it as part of her dowry when she married she married John Brown, didn't she? That's just as well I've got the words here to help me out. So that's when we get the first documentation of who lived there. And the archaeologists did find the date 1715 inscribed on the leaded window frame. So that's why we can say it was certainly there from then, but we think it was probably there before, but a much smaller building. So Martha Staniforth, she had a daughter, Lydia. The house passed down to Lydia, and when Lydia married John Sparrow, she took the house into that marriage, and John Sparrow, being from London, had to improve it all. So he built on, and then when he died, it passed on to their daughter and was then sold. So the Reeds, Joseph Reed, he bought it in 1816, and that's really where our story properly begins. Joseph Reed, now, he was a very interesting person, a very busy man. I don't think he was quite as good a businessman as his father, because I don't think he was quite that interested. He was very interested in what he could make the money do and how he could use that to invest in his various projects. But under his guardianship, the Reed & Co., which was to become the Sheffield Smelting Company, went through a very rocky period and very nearly bit the dust. So above all, he was a great friend and supporter of James Montgomery. So around about 1796, James Montgomery had spent 2 spells in York prison. James Montgomery had become the editor of the newspaper that had been the Sheffield Register. He renamed it as the Iris, and he'd inherited that post from Joseph Gales, who'd had to go to America because he had been considered to be too supportive of the French Revolution, just as Joseph Turner was in danger of being arrested. So Joseph Gales had gone, and James Montgomery had become the editor of the Register that became the Iris. But he found himself in York prison on charge of sedition, first of all, because he had printed a poem about the French Revolution. It wasn't written by him and only obliquely referred to the French Revolution, but the government was determined to make an example of Sheffield, as they do. And he went away, and then he came out, and then he was arrested again when he printed a negative report of the militia and the general quelling a riot. Joseph Reed had followed all this legal case, and he said it was a completely unjust sentence. So he supported James Montgomery, he paid his legal fees, and from then on, he became a friend of the family. So Mary Ann met him when she was just 11. So he was working at Reed and Lucas, and that's where a lot of his funds came from. He continued to be a member of Zion Congregational Chapel even after having moved to Wincobank, because the family travelled back there. He was a treasurer and supported the Rotherham Independent College, where they trained the ministers of the gospel. Now, one of the problems during the 1790s or so was that the nonconformists, because they didn't take communion with the Church of England, they were not able to attend the universities. There had been the Act of Toleration, which allowed them to worship, but they still couldn't hold government office, church office, or go to the universities, the old universities, Oxford in particular. When London University came on the stream, they allowed in the nonconformists, and eventually everybody else followed suit and the law was changed. But they had to train their own ministers and they had to fund that separately. He was also a great supporter of the anti-slavery movement, which was at that time a men's association. The women were not really supposed to be getting involved in campaigns and public duties. Up until the end of the 1700s, really, the women's sphere was at home. That was their domestic role. So with the coming of the changes of the 1800s, and particularly the nonconformist move towards the Sunday schools, the social work that went on, the women started taking a far more proactive role. But at the time of Joseph Reed joining the anti-slavery movement, it was just men. He also supported the West Riding London Missionary Society, and he had a lot of contacts there that eventually came to Wincobank. But he was very interested in politics. So it was interesting, you know, one wonders whether he might have been an MP himself, but he couldn't because at the time the law prevented that. So he was the vice chair of Wentworth's election campaign, and his daughters do have recorded in their own writing that they put a lot of pressure on him to make sure that Wentworth voted to support Wilberforce. So there is a lot of sort of family leverage going on. Now, importantly, he was also the major shareholder in the Chesterfield Ironworks, which belonged to his wife's parents. He also invested in the railways, the canals, and all the sort of new developments of the time. The Smith Ironworks in Chesterfield, the buildings are still there and they've recently been renovating, but it's quite interesting to see that John and Ebenezer Smith, so Ebenezer Smith was his father-in-law, and the firm closed in 1833, and it was the closure of that firm that nearly brought about the ruin of Joseph Reed. So Elizabeth Reed, she was a very interesting woman, and behind every interesting woman, there's a mother. So she was mother for Mary Ann, and she brought her 5 girls up to be very proactive and to be involved in her own campaigning work. She was fundraising for the Bible Society, which was about getting Bibles translated into home languages. One of the first things they did was translate the Bible into Welsh. And as a child, I remember reading the story of Mary Jones and her Bible, and I had really no idea that this was a factual account, but it was certainly representative of what was happening and the importance, because once the Bible was available to be read in a language that wasn't Latin, and for the Welsh it wasn't English, then of course the children needed to read. So she was also involved in sort of bigger educational projects. The Hibernian Society was about helping the poor Irish, so they were aware that there's a problem in Wales. The Aged Female Society is obviously one that I shall need to join. Speaks for itself. But Elizabeth Reed, she established the Sheffield Ladies Anti-Slavery Association, with Mary Ann Rawson. And you can see in that mother-daughter relationship there that she was modelling how she felt Mary Ann should continue. So the two of them together, they set that up. She took her daughters out campaigning. She was the one that took them out to get people to stop buying the sugar for the stop buying sugar from the West Indies. I'm not sure that they actually did a great job, because the sugar coming from the East Indies was probably not much better, but they felt they were doing the right thing. And she got 75% of the women in Sheffield to sign up to boycott the sugar. So they did it by going and talking to people. So effectively, all her 5 girls went out, doorstepped people, and just debated the whole issue of slavery in the colonies with very ordinary people on their doorsteps. And they would have known everybody in Wincobank. They would have been round knocking on all these doors. She also supported James Montgomery's work to better the condition of the poor. I love this wonderful society of the bettering of the condition of the poor. They had such brilliant names then. So, and also the Society for Superseding the Necessity for Climbing Boys. I think we should have that as a tongue twister. James Montgomery did a lot of work raising money for those. So they had a really good relationship there. Now, the Lancasterian schools were really interesting, because it's not about Lancaster. So I did have somebody telling me I got a spelling mistake in here, but this was a movement established by Joseph Lancaster, who was trying to introduce a more child-friendly system of education. So if you think about Hard Times and Gradgrind's approach to beating the information into children, they were trying to find ways of encouraging children to learn and being more inclusive, really. And one of their rules was that they shouldn't hit children, basically. Now, that gave them a problem. And I, as a primary teacher, know that it can be a problem. And they were very, very crude in their antisocial behaviour strategies, should we say, behaviour strategies. So sometimes they did pick the children up and put them in, and they had a cage at the side of the classroom that they would put them in. So I do have memories of a school teacher in the past picking a child up and putting them in the waste bin, in the wheelie bin, but I don't think we would do that now. But they were certainly on the right moves, in that they were trying to get away from harsh education and trying to find ways of opening up education for everybody. And while she was doing all this, she was a hands-on mum for all these children: Mary Ann, the oldest, Eliza, Catherine, Sarah, Emily, Edmund, who was a young one, and Julia, who sadly died when she was just a baby. So she took her daughters where they were. She took them out to have lunch with the climbing boys, make them sat down and talk to the poor children, so they got to know them and they understood them. So it was a privileged life, but it was the one that was full of awareness of what was going on. And Wincobank Hall itself just became a very interesting place. So if you think of these girls as teenage girls, who they didn't have all the things that teenagers do now, but they had a lot of very interesting people coming into their home. William Wilberforce, who was coming in, and a friend of their father's through his political work. Robert Moffat, George Bennett, William and Mary Ellis, all missionaries that travelled all over the world. So these people were going, William and Mary Ellis were going to Tahiti and Hawaii, and George Bennett was all over the place. Robert Moffat was David Livingstone's father-in-law. Very interesting people coming into their homes, talking to them, inspiring them, and just making them aware of what was going on outside. Anne and Joseph Gilbert, close friends of the family, were hymn writers, and Anne Gilbert, for me, is her greatest contribution to the world, was writing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, which has still got to be one of the best songs in the world. Alessandro Gavazzi came to Wincobank Hall. So he was a former monk who had then become preaching become well known preaching against the control of the Vatican in Italy. And eventually, Marianne and her daughter Lizzie were to go out to Italy and help fund the school in Turin. And there they met Garibaldi. Gavazzi became the chaplain for Garibaldi. So, you know, interesting times. Now, I'm just trying to move this on a little bit. It doesn't seem to want to move on. Oh, here we go. So also coming to Wincobank were quite a few people from America, including Lloyd Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, who was a great supporter of the temperance movement, as well as being an abolitionist. So he came because of his abolition work and in order to speak. Very often they came to Sheffield to speak. They would speak at Cutler's Hall, for example, and then she would bring them back. Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, what a wonderful name that was, came with Lloyd Garrison. And in fact, they met Marianne Rawson in London, travelled back with her on a train, and the trains were new. They were, you know, quite exciting at the time. Marianne Rawson had her daughter with her. Nathaniel Peabody Rogers was writing for a temperance newspaper in America, and he wrote a whole diary entry about this journey back from London with Marianne. He said she had her delightful young daughter with her. They fell to talking with her on the train, and she said, "You must come back for breakfast." So they were staying, Lloyd Garrison and Peabody Rogers were staying in Sheffield. And so the next day they came out, they said they left home at 8 o'clock in the morning. They got the train from Sheffield to Wincobank. I think they got the train from Midland Station, from the Royal Victoria Station. They came out to Wincobank. They walked up Wincobank Hill. They met James Montgomery on the way, who hailed them, and they came the rest of the journey together over the brow of the hill, and they said they came upon this Eden-like place, this beautiful place full of flowers and trees. And then they arrived at Wincobank Hall. They went into the dining room. They were ushered into the dining room, which was in fact the library, and they said it was filled with 10,000 of the newest edition books. They sat at a table with an elegant crowd, and they talked over their breakfast, which ran into lunch. And after lunch, Mrs. Rawson organised for them a carriage to take them to Wentworth, so they could go and look around Wentworth and meet Lord Wentworth. So Nathaniel Peabody Rogers remembered all this. He went back to America, he wrote about it, and he wrote about this extraordinary woman he'd met in this beautiful place. So to think that our Wincobank was out there. So time went by, these girls grew up, and Marianne, being the oldest, was the first to marry. So she married in 1828. She married William Bacon Rawson, who lived in Nottingham, but he was a great character in the Nottingham Anti-Slavery Society. And she had the wonderful address of an apartment in Nottingham Castle. She had a baby in the following year, or later on in that year, Elizabeth Rawson, and they were very happy. They were very happy. Eliza, her sister, married the following year. She married William Wilson, again from Nottingham, slightly older than her. He'd been married once before, and he had a daughter. His wife had died, so she inherited a stepdaughter as well. But he was interesting because his grandfather had been the last sheriff of Nottingham at a time when Nottingham had an English sheriff and a French sheriff still. And then after that, he became the Lord Mayor of Nottingham. So a little girl was born in 1829, followed by their son, Joseph Reed. So Joseph Reed Wilson. So everything was looking really good, but unfortunately, it didn't last. So what happened next? I think we seem to have lost the slide, but I can tell you. What happened next, sadly, if I go back a bit, oops, go back, was the following year, 1829, William Bacon Rawson died of TB. Then Mary Ann Rawson came back with her baby to Wincobank on her own, bereft, absolutely bereft. And then the following year, Joseph Wilson, the baby, her sister's baby, he died, swiftly followed by their sister, 23-year-old Sarah Theodosia. So 3 deaths so soon together. At the same time, their father had invested money in the Chesterfield Ironworks, and that money had the problem was that it was owned by their in-laws, and the company's profits had gone right down because their main product had been the armaments for the Napoleonic War. The Napoleonic War had finished. There wasn't a great need for cannonballs, and the factory went out of business. Now, the ironworks went out of business because the new material was steel. Everybody wanted steel. They didn't want iron. Joseph Reed was stuck with the dilemma of what to do, and he decided it was much better to clear his wife's parents' debts than let them face the shame of bankruptcy. And his own brother said, "But you're putting your family at risk." And he said, I can't help it. This is what I have to do. So Wincobank Hall was put up for sale. The family moved back to Royds Mill. Some of the land was sold off, and Joseph Reed sold everything he had, but his horses. He said he wouldn't sell his horses because they were so old, they would only go for meat, and he couldn't see that. So it was a really, really difficult time. Mary Ann Rawson, young, what would she do? She was to find an extraordinary development in that she came across an unexpected legacy that should have come to her husband, and she was able to clear her father's debts, buy Wincobank Hall, bring her mother and sisters back to live there, and so they became established here on their own. So their father never recovered, really. He died a few years later. But they carried on with the family. They managed to keep the business going. William Wilson took an interest, that was Eliza's husband, took an interest in the business, the Sheffield Smelting Works, and their brother Edmund, who was quite young, worked with him. They tried to keep that going for a while. But Mary Ann Rawson, who could really have just gone to pieces, and she did say, she writes how desperate she is and how bereft. She seems to have thrown herself into her work. So despite being a widow and a mother, she was a passionate Christian. She believed very much in the values that she'd grown up with. She cared about her family history. She cared about keeping and recording it. So I think she wanted this history told, because it's all there, carefully stored away. She wrote letters. She wrote letters to people all over the world, asking them to write back, to condemn slavery, to oppose the system as it stood. She put their letters together into albums, and she published those. She circulated those and got them onto the coffee tables of the rich and the influential. She campaigned in many different ways. She kept inviting people to Wincobank Hall. This idea of it as a hospitality centre continued. She raised money with her associates, and then her own artwork, which I suppose all Victorian ladies were expected to be artists in those times, but was still very sensitive and lovely. But from Lloyd Garrison, who'd been there, William Lloyd Garrison, from that meeting when he brought Nathaniel Peabody Rogers out, from that point on, she banished the decanter from the table. She said she was convinced that the alcohol was doing damage to the community, to the people who were trying to keep their families together on low incomes, who were depressed. And she became ardent. She was one of the first people to sign the pledge. And she got her nephews, her sister's sons, to sign the pledge when they were very young. So this is some of her artwork. She went up onto Wincobank Hill. This is in the University of Sheffield's collection. And I just think this is lovely because if you go up to Wincobank Hill today, it looks very much the same. This is one of the albums she put together. All these are in the Montgomery collection in the University of Sheffield. So when James Montgomery died, she pulled together everything that he'd had an interest in, anything he'd helped her with, leaflets and letters. And her work, it reflected her work with the anti-slavery campaigns. Now, we kept seeing in various publications, particularly the work of Dr. Alison Twells from Sheffield Hallam University. She was the one that introduced this painting to us first of all, and it is in her book, which has a whole chapter on the Reed family. This is a painting from the of the first, what is effectively the first meeting of Anti-Slavery International. It's listed as their first meeting in 1840. So if you think that the abolition of the slave trade was 1807 and the abolition of slavery in the British colonies was 1833, then here we are in 1840 still campaigning for the universal abolition of slavery. So it wasn't enough to say, tick the box, the British have done it, which is what a lot of the politicians said. We'll tick that one, a bit like Brexit, let's try and move on. The women started saying, no, 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 we haven't done it yet. And they restarted the ladies' societies. They took their, the way it tended to work is that the women would put pressure on the men. It still works like that sometimes today, not quite as effectively as maybe it did once, but they went down and they went to this meeting in London. Now, at the very back of this picture are the American women who came over just thinking they would be able to speak because they had been very active in the campaigns in the United States. And they were told, no, 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 in Britain, women don't talk in public. So they were eventually, after 4 days, they were allowed in. But this meeting is considered to be one of the key moments where women began to think, well, if the Americans are expecting to be able to speak, then we should. So in this picture, we've got a handful of women. We've got over on the right, Mary Ann Rawson in her little white bonnet, and Amelia Opie next to her in her Quaker's hat. Over here, we've got Lady, this is Thomas Clarkson's wife and son. And over here, we've got Lady Byron. She's around here. All these people are listed. And this is Thomas Beckford, who was a former slave who came over, and he's pictured in the center of the picture, and Thomas Clarkson is speaking. Now, the painter, whose name has just escaped me, which was a terrible, terrible thing, he made this his last piece of work. He spent 3 years going around documenting the people that were in this portrait because he felt it was important to witness the people that had been present. And he was vilified, really, and particularly criticised because at the time they thought it was shocking to put Thomas Beckford in the middle of the photo, to put a black man in the middle of the, not photo, painting. So, and he committed suicide because he couldn't cope with all the criticism and the loss of money. We wanted to see the painting, so we went down and we found it. We thought it would be stuck away in a storeroom, but here it is, fixed on the National Portrait Gallery, permanent fixture on the National Portrait Gallery wall. Really important, and we've got our own copy in the chapel here. So how did Mary Ann work? She worked with her friends in the Ladies' Anti-Association that she restarted in 1837. And they appealed to the women to try and get the women to identify with the the women that were enslaved, to get them to understand how it must have felt to lose your children and suffer in that way. So they were trying to get that connection, and they weren't supposed to petition the women here. They were allowed to circulate information and raise funds, but they did it in such a way that they got their voice heard. They were quite subtle, and they made work bags that they filled with pamphlets and information that quoted directly the newspaper articles coming from Jamaica, and particularly the adverts where the slave owners were trying to trace the escaped slaves and were describing them by the terrible injuries and the maiming and the wounding, almost like identity marks. And so they were really condemning themselves with their own words. So they weren't using hearsay, they were using primary source evidence that they were circulating. So the women were making needlework bags, giving them or selling them to other women who were taking them home, opening them. And I suppose they were smuggling this information out into society. They were giving it to people who might have said, oh, no, I don't want to know that. But they were giving them the information so that they had to confront it. And in the same way, the albums, which looked very sort of pretty on the outside, once you started to read them, had the information inside. They had the reports of the brutality, the terrible conditions, and the unfair, just the wrongness of it all. But they had to get this into the houses of the influential. So they were trying to get them into the politicians' houses. So she'd grown up helping with the anti-slavery movement of her mother. And as I said, 1833, everybody thought, oh, we've done that, closed the societies down. But 1837, she'd opened the Ladies' Society up again. These are the work cards that went into the bags. And here's a little bit of an extract. So it's hoped that it may realise to many the cruel sufferings inflicted on the African race so long and still so remorselessly oppressed by Christian Europe. It may remind us of our former guilt so present before God, and of our continued guilt in still permitting the slave trade to be carried on in the Mauritius. Now, the information was coming from all over the world, and they were making it clear that they knew what was going on. So we know that it wasn't just middle-class white women who were solving the problem, but they were doing their bit within the confines of their lives, which were very limited. They were stepping beyond their normal comfort zone, and they were trying to engage with what they saw as a great iniquity. One of the visitors, interesting visitors to Wincobank Hall, was Frederick Douglass, and he was brought here by William Lloyd Douglas. So William Lloyd Douglas had organised the speaking tour for Frederick Douglass to come over from America, and they spoke at Cutler's Hall. And the day after, he brought him up to Wincobank Hall specifically to meet Mary Ann Rawson, and he's written that in his diary, so his own journal. So that must have been an extraordinary meeting, and something that must have stayed with her, because he was an amazing man. I've read the book, so all I can say is get the book, My Bondage and My Freedom, and read it, because it's very, very extraordinary. She carried on campaigning. She kept her eye and ears open, and even at the age of 74, she was still rustling feathers, making waves. And one of the things that they picked up was that the Lord High Admiral had issued instructions. So this is 1875, all that time after we thought the slave trade and all the problem had gone away, some people might say. the British Navy were instructed that if they found fugitive slaves, they should be returned to their owners. But it was argued that the law said that once you were on British territory and a British Navy ship should be considered British territory, they were free people. But there was a big controversy about this. There was a huge meeting at the town hall. Mark Firth was the Lord Mayor at the time. A lot of people were there, including her nephew, Henry Joseph Wilson, who went on to be MP for Home Firth. And it says, the body of the hall was fairly filled. Those present included, and it lists everybody, all the men, and then it says at the end, several ladies were amongst those present. Now, we know from other writings that she was there and that she was one of the instigators of the meeting, but it is an interesting reflection of the times that they didn't name any of these women. So they weren't supposed to be there. They weren't going to be named. Whether they thought they were doing them a favour or not, I don't know. But she was certainly there. And thank you to the archives, Pete Evans, who sent me huge wadges of newspaper photocopies, but nowhere could I actually find her name. But she would have been there because she would have been working with Henry Wilson. So back to Wincobank. Back to Wincobank, and we have Wincobank Chapel. So this following year of going down to London, being part of the anti-slavery campaign, she comes back and she has been raising funds through the British and Foreign Bible Society to build a school. So not just concerned about what was going on overseas, she was concerned about what was going on the doorstep. And here we've got this little school. It's a little bit smaller than it is today. It was slightly extended later on, and the beautiful house for the school teacher. And that's the school teacher's house there, a little bit later, in 2005. So still standing, and the chapel behind it. Now, she went on to set up a trust to protect those buildings because they'd realised when her father had faced bankruptcy and selling the estate that the chapel that they had founded, and I omitted to tell you that when they bought Wincobank Hill, one of the first things they did was set up a chapel in the coach house and a school, could be Sunday school, could be day school, in the laundry. They'd done that straight away. That chapel in the coach house continued to be used for 60 years, but they moved the church, the school and the Sunday school into the building that is now the chapel. And she wanted that protected so that when she died, the hall would be sold, but that school would be protected and they would be able to continue to worship there as a chapel inside. So she said in the indenture that if it was no longer needed as a school, it could be used for a place of worship, but it had to be for the simple preaching of Christ's gospel without sectarian bias. And that's why its name is Wincobank Undenominational Chapel. So it is of no denomination. It is for anybody of any denomination. And it was a forward-thinking, popular term in the end of the 1800s, 1900s. Nowadays, they might use non-denominational, but it's actually got a slightly different feel to it, because undenominational was a very positive move, that they're saying, we don't want lots of different sects. We want this to be for everybody. Whereas non-denominational is more like, oh, well, everybody can come, whatever sect you are. So it's slightly different. It's just a bit of subtlety. But Emily Reed, she continued to teach in the day school, and she continued to run the Sunday school. And her niece, Helen Wilson, described her. This is from her description. She was very practical. She was very caring. She was concerned with the chapel. She managed it. She looked after it. So I bet, like Rosemary, she did the cleaning here. I bet she did everything. She sorted it out. She had a big bunch of keys at her waist, and always had plenty of tracts, religious tracts, like bits of advice in her pocket, something for every occasion that she could hand out to people if they were in trouble or doubt. very strong in faith, a friend to all. But she never married. She stayed here, and she seems to have the record as having started as a Sunday school teacher in Zion Chapel when she was 5 years old and continuing here until she died. So there is a memorial to her on the wall behind me. And we mustn't forget the other sister, Eliza, or the other sisters. So Eliza was the second sister. She went off, she married William Wilson, and she had a number of her own children, a lot of her own children, as well as a stepdaughter to bring up. But Eliza was very poorly. She had a bad chest, and quite a few of her children died also. So Catherine, her sister Catherine, who is in the middle there, she brought the rest of the children up after Eliza died. For 11 years, she stayed with the family. She'd looked after them as children. She'd looked after her sister Eliza. And there she is with the Wilson family and the Wilson grandma in the middle. And then she came back, looked after her mother who was ill, and then she died about 9 months after her mother. So although it might seem she didn't have much of a life, she had a lot of influence because this family, the Wilson family, went on to be MPs, Lord Mayors, and their children went on to be MPs. One of the grandchildren of this family was MP for Attercliffe for 28 years in all. Very, very interesting. That's another talk altogether about the Wilsons. We have a lovely story about the 1881 burglary at Wincobank Hall, but that's a story for another day. And then we go on and we find 1887, she dies. And it's interesting to note that in the report of her death, it says basically she was forgotten in her own lifetime. So a name better known to the past than the present generation of the people of Sheffield. And that sadly was the story, because as she died, she was buried in Attercliffe graveyard, and her grave was forgotten, and the church was forgotten. She didn't forget here because she left her, this says, so I leave to the trustees of Wincobank School, for the school, or rather for the room appropriated for worship, the desk, tables, chairs, and benches in the chapel and laundry. So that's in the big house. Also the chapel stove and our pew and its contents, cushions, old books, hassocks, not worth much, but they might be of some use. Now that was her afterthoughts to a very long, complicated legal will, but her afterthoughts were about maintaining the chapel here in Wincobank. So the chapel in Zion had moved on. Her father's chapel had been demolished. That had been rebuilt as a nice big fancy church. She was buried there with her family, but her heart, I think, was here in Wincobank. Her grave was forgotten. The graveyard was overgrown. As you may know, we did find it again in 2017, and it was something out of Sleeping Beauty. We quite quickly found the family grave, which was under a load of litter by a fence. And nowadays it looks a lot better. But that is a talk for another time, or come down and have a look for yourself. An extraordinary story there. So 1902, and Wincobank is looking a little bit different. So still not many houses on Newman Road. So we're still, there's a few houses down here. There's a farm down there. Here's Wincobank Hall. So this painting was painted after, before it was demolished. It hangs in the chapel here. We know that when Mary Ann Rawson died, she hoped it would be sold, and she hoped it would raise 4,000, that could be invested in a lifetime stipend for the teacher and pastor at the chapel. Sadly, it couldn't be sold because she hadn't got around to maintaining it. Their focus had been on their work, their campaigns, and they hadn't mended the roof, I don't think. So it stood empty for quite a few years until it was used as an industrial home for women in distress. And that meant they were given training so that they could then take work on. So I think this is a bit of domestic abuse, a bit of a refuge for women, and trying to make them independent so that they could then go and earn their own living. And it was managed by the Salvation Army. And interestingly, her great niece, Dr. Ruth Wilson, was the warden here. So Helen Wilson was her other niece, who is a very interesting person. But the house was managed, I think, more for John Wycliffe Wilson, her nephew, and his daughter Ruth, who were part of the Salvation Army. And it was later used as an orphanage, which is very possibly connected with the fact that John Wycliffe Wilson was chair of the Board of Guardians at the workhouse, Furvale Workhouse, when they were trying to get the children out of the workhouse. And he developed the Sheffield Scattered Homes system of placing children in the community. So it could be a coincidence this was an orphanage, or there could be a connection. We haven't quite found that connection out. We went on, and the chapel was developed. It was a very busy place. It was a centre of the community, and it was extended with a concert hall in 1927, built on the back of the schoolhouse here. So lots of people had memories of that concert hall because it wasn't demolished. Well, it says 1987. I think it was possibly more like 82 from what I've heard, but this has come from the council's planning and conservation department. They made this drawing and it was in their files, so perhaps they're right. The flower estate was built, first of all down towards First Park, but eventually it filled the space that was left when Wincobank Hall was demolished. The hall was bought by Alfred Schofield, the builder who had the building brickworks down by what's now Hindhouse School, and he built the last part of the flower estate on that area. It's interesting that Wincobank Hall was known to have very ornamental flower gardens. It was very well known for its beautiful flowers. So John Wycliffe Wilson was also chair of the housing committee. He was part of the team that encouraged the building of the flower estate in the first place. They were going to build another estate, similar estate at High Stores, but it was decided that that land was too valuable, which is quite interesting. So I think John Wycliffe Wilson wanted it built here. They wanted it, and it benefited the community. And I like to think that the flower gardens are still there in the names of the streets. So 1934, it becomes a bit more built up. Here we got part of the flower estate now on the area of Wincobank Hall. This is the hill fort here, and Danny is going to tell you more about that if you want to join our Zoom talk at the beginning of May. I've got the date at the end for you. This is the Roman Ridge down here. So there's a whole big story around that to find out. And then Wincobank was known, I'm reliably informed, by Connie Wiedeker, who's sadly now passed on, but was the local historian of her day. It was the prettiest village in God's country. And this was the front of the chapel. Absolutely beautiful, really neat and tidy, and a busy, busy place. It survived the war. There was damage in the war, but that was eventually repaired. They had to have a license to get the damage repaired, but eventually it was pulled through, and lots of things happened. It was a very, very busy place, and we've got a lovely archive here full of interesting bits and pieces to do with what happened in the past and all the things that went on here. So we've had a lot of support, a lot of help, particularly from John Vincent, who put a lot of energy into and encouragement into helping the congregation keep this building going since the 1980s, when the congregation became the trustees. And it continued as an independent chapel. It's completely independent. It's not linked into any other church organisation at all. It has no funding from anywhere else. It all comes from what is raised here and what is paid in rent and what we apply for in grants. So the Sunday school has been a big part of this story so far. It's just having a little bit of a dip at the moment while the next generation comes through, but they're on their way. Lots of people have got stories of all the social activities that have happened here. Well known for the fact that Marty Kane learnt to dance at Sally Carmichael's dance school. Youth clubs, play screen, all sorts of things have happened here, and we hope it will go into the future. It had a difficult time in the 1990s. This was the view out of the back window just before, this was what stood there before the Amaranthus estate was built, and this had just been demolished when I came. I came here around 2004, so I could only just see the ground and try to make out what had been beneath. But this was the sad story. But this was the community this chapel served, and that there was a kind of interesting relationship, because at the same time as supporting them, the community actually vandalized the chapel. So it had to be a lot of work to restore it again. So 2002, Indigit, with a bit of encouragement, I think, from David Blunkett, managed to get a grant to replace the roof and the windows and do all sorts of work inside. And I came along just after that. And I was just so impressed, because it was the young people and the people, their parents, who had done a lot of the work themselves. What we couldn't do, not me, but what they couldn't do themselves was done professionally. I came along at the point where we were putting in the toilets and replacing the kitchen, and it's now wonderful. Then the Amaranthus estate was rebuilt at the back, and what had been level ground suddenly went up 15 foot. It changed the landscape completely. But all through that, we've had incredible support and wonderful support from so many people. And really, it was when Meg Munn, who is the MP, phoned up and said, "Can I come and see the inside of the chapel?" And she said, "There's so much material about Mary Ann Rawson in the archives." She came at the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. And she came because she knew of the connection with Mary Ann Rawson. At the same time, Indigit had created the Wilberforce Walk, the Wilberforce Way, that led from Hull to York. And we walked a section of that, and we found a mention of Wincobank Hall in Hull in the Wilberforce Museum. So that's really what set us off on that trail. And we invited Alison Twells from Hallam University to come and tell us more. So I don't know much. I'm not a historian. I've just pulled together what I've gathered from other people and tried to share it as a story. And I will have got things a bit wrong here and there, because I just tried to piece it all together. But it is a fantastic story. It's had a great past, and it must have a future. It's got a huge future. It's got a lovely congregation, a brilliant congregation. All sorts of things happen here. And this was our last May Queen crowned in 2010. Now, what's lovely is that the young people now that were in that youth club, not only have they having their own children now, but they're trustees. And Matt there in his white shirt is one of our trustees. So it's all carrying on. It's all still alive. And it's an open invitation for everybody, because we need you. We need everybody that's joined this Zoom, everybody that's ever walked in through the Heritage Open Days, that's come into any of the many activities we usually use. We need your support. We need to reconnect, because this is difficult times for everybody now. Getting going again, getting the confidence to come out, getting things going, moving on, facing whatever needs to change. So there's the email address at the bottom. It's easy to remember because it's Upper Wincobank Undenominational, or undenominational is hopeless on an email address. So it's uwchapel@gmail.com. And we've got a Facebook page. And we've got a website, but that's about to change into something else soon. So you can still find it. If you Google us, there's loads of stuff about Upper Wincobank Chapel if you just Google us. But we want to invite you. We want you to invite you to our socially distanced garden party on the 1st of May. And if you'd like to be part of a memory patchwork project, to get your project onto your memories, onto a bit of patchwork, I've got a mystery bag here full of everything you may need. Just drop me a text. We'd like you to invite you to join in our next Zoom, which is on 6th of May, which will be Danny, who's archaeologist, talking about Wincobank Hill. So if you look at Friends of Wincobank Hill, and we'll put that link onto the Upper Wincobank Chapel Facebook page as well, you can pick that up. we'd like to invite you down to see Zion Graveyard and Mary Ann Rawson and the Reed family's grave. So we'll be reopening for that for the public on the 11th of May. So we have a Facebook page for that as well. Just put in Zion Graveyard. But that's always the afternoon between 2 and 5. So please stay in contact. And if you want to add anything to what I've said, if you've got little nuggets of things or questions or something you think needs just pointing up, because there's so much and I've overrun and I, can't help it. Just email me or text me or get in touch. We need you. Thank you. That's it. Right. So what we can do now is I'll stop sharing, and it might be a bit difficult with quite so many people on. Let's find out how many people we ended up with. 56 people here today, which is fantastic. So maybe the thing to do is, oh dear, the meeting is very echoey. So I'm really sorry if you couldn't hear it properly. Where was Roy's Mill? Roy's Mill is down in Attercliffe. If you drive down, go along Attercliffe towards Sheffield, around Washford Bridge way. I can't explain it any better than that, but it's still there, and you'll find Tesco there. So I'm really sorry if the sound was bad. That's probably the echoing in the church, but I'm using our super new internet here. So if there's anything else, that's fine, but just email me and I'll be in touch. And thank you very much for sticking with me. Is there anything else we need to say, anybody, to type it into the chat box?
Are there any books on the subject?
Not yet. I've got one to write. No, there is a book. There's a really good book.
So they can now hear us.
Okay, so the gentleman's asking about the book. There's a very interesting book called 200 Precious Years of Metal, the story of the Sheffield Smelting Company.
This is interesting, this bit.
It will be in the local studies library, or you can get it. We've found several copies on Amazon.
All right.
The Ronald Wilson, one of the great grandchildren, who is the last director of the family in the Sheffield Smelting Company, he wrote it.
Don't we send a message to her?
So have a look for that one. That's 200 years of precious metal. So did she make the people she's fighting for? I don't know. I think she went to America. I mean, she obviously met Frederick Douglass, but I don't know who else she met. And there was another question there that's just disappeared. I've lost it. Let me see if I can find them. Well, that's very nice. Rob Cottrell says, incredible story. It is important. We must tell it over and over again in Sheffield. And if you can help us to tell it, that's why we want to develop the Chapel House as a community asset and also to tell the story. So somebody's dad grew up on Honeysuckle Road. Oh, that's lovely. Scan it or photograph it and send it to us. That would be good. And I'm glad the sound was good for you. So yes,
The talk to all the girls that lived in.
Yeah,
you did. And I think I wonder if we should leave now. I will send.
Right, I can hear you. So you can go if you want, or you can stay if you want. And probably if you drop out as you want to, that's fine. Just press end. And anybody that wants to hang about a bit longer is fine. But I'd love to see the photo of your dad at Shine Green School. That would be really nice. And thank you for all the thanks. That was really good. I'm sorry it was a bit rambly and backstrummed.
Well, I want to thank her, and if she can hear, thank you, but I don't know how to do it.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Well, thank you. We've had a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Been very interesting, Penny. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Yes, thank you, Penny. I'm sat here with my mum,
Good.
and we've really enjoyed it down in Wincobank on Standing Road, and we've had a lovely evening. Thank you very much.
Excellent. We'll keep in touch and come when we're open on Heritage Open Day.
We will do. I went to the dance class, so
Did you?
I have a memory. Yes,
brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yes.
That's lovely.
Thank you, Penny.
That's great. I hope I have recorded it, and if so, I'll put it somewhere where you can get at it. Thank you. Okay.
Penny, how do you get onto the talk about Wincobank Hill?
Right. Well, it'll be another link in the same way. We'll send
All
it
right.
out. Who is it
Will
that's
it be through Eventbrite?
Eventbrite? It will be, but I don't know where you picked this up from. Did we email
Yeah.
it to you? I'm not sure who's
I got it
speaking.
from Eventbrite, yeah.
Who's
And then you
speaking?
emailed it.
Is that Sandra?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, Sandra. Okay, so we put it out on. We'll email it to Friends of Wincobank Hill. I don't know if
Yeah.
you're on that, on the email.
I'd like to be a friend.
Good. Well, do you know what's nice is that those groups are as much about being friends as they are about looking after the places. It's a lovely way of keeping in touch.
And have been to Zion, this graveyard. I've
Brilliant.
seen her grave.
Good.
Yes. So I would like to know more about Mary Ann Rawson.
Well, come back again because we're just putting up some wonderful information panels in the graveyard that tell you all sorts of interesting things about Attercliffe and the family.
Well, my family come from Attercliffe, so.
Brilliant. Come again and have a look. That's
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good night, everybody. It's lovely to see
Good
you.
night. Thank you.
Take care. All right.
Yes, very
Bye-bye.
interesting.
I'm going to end it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, bye-bye.